Nebraska Territory, 1888. While his neighbors threw up standard claim shanties with high open rafters, Lars Nilsson was still hammering in late November. Inside his 12 by 24-foot cabin, he'd built something they called wasteful. A flat ceiling dropped to just 7 feet, 3 full feet below his roofline. They laughed at him for heating a closet, called it city nonsense. Why waste lumber and nails building a ceiling when you already had a roof? But when the children's blizzard hit on January 12th, everything changed. 30-mile-per-hour winds, 2 feet of snow in 6 hours, temperatures that turned standard cabins into ice boxes. In those high-rafted rooms, thermometers at head height couldn't hold 43 degrees. Families huddled in blankets, burning through their wood piles twice as fast and still shivering. But in that fool's cabin with the low ceiling, the thermometer read 58 degrees at the same height. 15 degrees warmer in the space where people actually lived and breathed. The difference wasn't luck, and it wasn't a better stove. What did this Scandinavian immigrant understand about heat, air volume, and survival that everyone else had missed? And how did his wasteful ceiling become the fix that neighbors quietly copied all winter long? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and state. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The wind across the Nebraska prairie carried a bite that January morning in 1888, cutting through the gaps in poorly chinked walls and finding every crack around door frames. Inside Lars Nilsson's claim house, a simple wall thermometer hung at exactly 5 feet from the floor, the height where a man's chest would be when he sat at his table, where his children's heads reached when they stood beside him. The mercury read 58 degrees, steady and reliable despite the howling outside that rattled windows and sent snow spiraling past the glass. 300 yards east, in Caleb Wright's nearly identical cabin, another thermometer hung at the same careful height. Same cast iron stove, same split oak burning in the firebox, same 2-room layout with a 12 by 24-foot main room. But Wright's mercury struggled to hold 43 degrees, 15 degrees colder in the exact space where his family lived and breathed. The difference wasn't bravado or luck or a better grade of stove iron. It was geometry, specifically the geometry of the space each stove was asked to heat. Lars had done something his neighbors called wasteful. Above his head, spanning the entire main room, stretched a flat ceiling of tight-stretched canvas supported by simple pine joists. The ceiling sat at 7 feet exactly, high enough for a tall man to walk without stooping, low enough to capture and hold the warm air where it mattered. Above that canvas lay 3 feet of empty space reaching up to the actual roof peak, a dark pocket that most visitors never saw and many never suspected existed. Wright's room, like every other standard claim house in the township, opened straight up to the rafters. 10 feet of vertical space from floor to ridgeline, all of it heated by the same firebox that Lars used to warm his smaller, contained volume. The math was brutal. Wright's stove fought to heat nearly 2,900 cubic feet of air. Lars's stove only had to manage about 2,100 cubic feet in the living space below his ceiling. 800 cubic feet less air to warm, 800 cubic feet less space to steal heat from the zone where people actually needed it. The canvas ceiling had taken Lars 2 full days to install, working alone with materials that cost him $4.30, money that Wright had spent on an extra cord of split oak. Wright called it city nonsense, the kind of fussy improvement that Eastern folks brought to the prairie before they learned to build practical. Why waste good lumber on joists when you already had rafters? Why stretch canvas when you already had a roof? The local wisdom was simple. High ceilings meant more space, less smoke hanging in the room, less chance of bumping your head on low beams when you worked inside during winter storms. Lars answered with the oldest frontier argument a man could make. I'm not heating rafters. He'd learned the principle not from books or building manuals, but from watching teepees during his first year in the territory. The Plains people used interior liners that rose only about 6 feet, leaving a gap between the liner and the outer cover that managed airflow and kept the living space comfortable. Settlers had been using muslin ceilings in claim houses for years, not for beauty, but because raw roofs shed dust, bits of bark, and worse things into the rooms below. Lars simply applied the same logic to heat management. The installation had been straightforward, the kind of carpentry any homesteader could manage with basic tools. He'd marked a level line around the room at 7 feet using a chalked string and his eye for level, then nailed simple ledgers, strips of pine 1 inch by 2 inches, into the wall studs and the few interior posts that supported the main ridge beam. Across those ledgers, he'd laid joists every 20 inches, nothing fancy, just straight pine boards that would carry the weight of stretched canvas without sagging. The canvas itself was heavy duck cloth, the same material used for wagon covers, bought in a 40-yard bolt from the supply store in town. He'd stretched it tight as a drumhead, tacking it to the joists with carpet tacks spaced every 6 inches, pulling it taut enough that a coin dropped from chest height would bounce. The whole ceiling used 38 yards of canvas, leaving him enough extra to patch any tears that might develop over time. He'd left one small hatch, about 18 inches square, near the stovepipe where it passed through to the roof. Not for convenience, but for necessity. The space above the ceiling needed some air movement to prevent moisture buildup, and he needed access for the twice-yearly job of checking the stovepipe for creosote and clearing out any mice or birds that might find their way into the void. The hatch cover was a simple square of board held in place with 4 small bolts. The effect was immediate and measurable. Heat from the stove rose, as it always did, but instead of washing uselessly up into the rafters, it pooled against the canvas ceiling and spread horizontally across the room. The air above the ceiling, that 3-foot pocket of space, stayed cold, sometimes nearly as cold as the outdoors, but it formed a buffer that slowed heat loss through the roof. The living space below stayed consistently warmer, warm enough that Lars could work at his table in shirt sleeves, while right next door kept his coat on, even when sitting close to his stove. The wood consumption difference was just as stark. Wright burned through 28 to 30 pounds of split oak each day during hard cold, feeding his stove every 2 hours to maintain even marginal comfort. Lars used 20 to 22 pounds for better results, saving 6 to 8 pounds daily, enough to extend his wood pile by weeks over a long winter. The fuel he saved wasn't just money, it was security. Every pound of wood not burned in January was a pound available in March, when the last storms could be the most dangerous and supply trips to town became impossible. But the neighbors weren't impressed by mathematics or efficiency. They saw a man who'd complicated a simple room, who'd spent money on materials that served no visible purpose, who'd created work where none was needed. What they couldn't see was the thermal lid that kept the warmth where it belonged, or the calm air pocket above that broke the straight path from stove heat to winter sky. Lars had not invented the principle from thin air or clever speculation. The idea of containing warm air in a smaller space while using a larger structure for protection came from sources his neighbors might have respected if they'd understood where to look. During his second winter in the territory, he'd spent 3 weeks helping a Lakota family repair storm damage to their lodge, payment for shelter during a blizzard that had caught him too far from his own claim. What he had learned in those weeks had nothing to do with romance or noble savage mythology. It was engineering. The tipi used 2 distinct barriers against the cold. The outer cover of buffalo hide or canvas formed the weather shell, sloped to shed wind and precipitation. But 6 feet up from the ground, a second barrier, the liner or dew cloth, created an interior wall that rose only to shoulder height on a standing man. Between the outer cover and the inner liner, a gap of 12 to 18 inches formed a channel that moved air in a controlled pattern. Cold air entered near the ground, warmed as it rose along the outer wall, and exhausted through the smoke opening at the top, creating a draft that pulled smoke up and out while keeping the living space below the liner comfortable. The liner itself was precisely positioned and tensioned. Made of softer, more flexible hide or trade cloth, it attached to lodge poles at specific points that had been calculated through generations of refinement. The bottom edge was weighted with stones or stakes, creating a seal against the ground that prevented cold air from washing across the floor where people slept and worked. The top edge stopped at exactly the height where warm air began to stratify, about 6 feet, the zone where heat would pool against the liner and spread horizontally rather than rising uselessly toward the smoke hole. Lars had watched the temperature difference with his own hands, not instruments. Below the liner, the air stayed warm enough for detailed work, beadwork, tool repair, food preparation. Above the liner, in the space between inner and outer walls, the air was noticeably cooler, sometimes cold enough to see breath during severe weather. The warm living space was roughly half the volume of the entire lodge structure, but it stayed consistently comfortable, while the full space would have been impossible to heat with the relatively small fire that burned in the center ring. When he'd returned to his own claim house that spring, the parallel was obvious. His cabin was trying to heat a space that rose uselessly to the roof peak, just as a teepee without a liner would waste heat in the upper portions where no one lived or worked. The solution was the same: create a barrier that captured warm air in the zone where people actually existed, and let the space above serve as insulation rather than living area. The principle appeared in settler construction more often than most people realized, though rarely with the precision that Plains peoples had developed. Homesteaders commonly stretched cheesecloth or muslin across the undersides of rafters, partly to catch debris that fell from rough roofs, partly to reduce drafts, and partly, though few would have articulated it clearly, to make interior spaces easier to heat. The cloth ceilings were usually rough affairs, sagging between supports, more functional than engineered, but they worked well enough that experienced settlers considered them essential for winter comfort. Mrs. Hannah Price, the midwife who traveled between homesteads during difficult births and long illnesses, had seen dozens of claim houses over her 8 years in the territory. She could predict which homes would be comfortable during winter visits simply by looking up when she entered. Houses with cloth ceilings, even poorly installed ones, stayed warmer where people needed warmth. Houses open to the rafters forced families to huddle near stoves and struggle with cold drafts that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The mechanics were straightforward once understood. Heat from any source, stove, fireplace, or oil lamp, rose according to the basic physics of warm air. In a room open to the roof, that warm air kept rising until it reached the highest point, where it spread along the underside of the roof and began cooling. As it cooled, it fell along the walls, creating convection currents that pulled warm air continuously upward and away from the living zone. The result was a room where the ceiling might be warm enough to make a man sweat, while the floor stayed cold enough to numb his feet. A properly installed ceiling barrier interrupted that cycle. Warm air still rose, but it met the canvas or cloth at 7 feet and spread horizontally across the room instead of washing up to the rafters. The air above the ceiling, the dead space that served no human purpose, quickly reached equilibrium with the outdoor temperature and stayed there, forming an insulating layer between the heated living space and the roof where heat would otherwise escape to the sky. The temperature difference was measurable even with simple tools. Mrs. Price carried a small thermometer in her medical kit, partly to monitor patients, but partly to assess whether a house would be safe for extended care during winter emergencies. She'd recorded the difference between cloth-sealed rooms and open-raftered rooms dozens of times, typically 10 to 18 degrees warmer at chest height, consistent enough that she could predict which families would need extra blankets and which would be comfortable in normal winter clothing. Lars had refined the technique beyond the rough cloth ceilings most settlers used. His canvas was properly tensioned and supported, creating a flat, stable barrier that wouldn't sag or tear under its own weight. The joists were sized and spaced to carry the load without deflection, installed level so the ceiling would shed dust rather than collecting it in low spots. The access hatch let him inspect and maintain the space above, checking for mouse nests, examining the stovepipe, and ensuring that the moisture balance stayed correct. The total cost, $4.30 for lumber, canvas, and hardware, was less than many settlers spent on a single cord of firewood. The installation required no special skills beyond basic carpentry, and no tools more sophisticated than a hammer, saw, and level. Yet the improvement in comfort and fuel efficiency was dramatic enough to change how a family experienced winter. What had once been an endurance contest against cold became manageable, predictable, controlled. The technique connected modern homesteading to older knowledge that stretched back generations, linking Scandinavian fuel conservation, Plains people's airflow management, and practical American frontier building into a single solution that worked regardless of its cultural origins. January 12th, 1888 began like any other winter morning on the Nebraska plains. The temperature sat at 12 degrees below zero at dawn, cold but not dangerous by frontier standards. Children walked to the one-room schoolhouse bundled in wool coats and scarves, their breath forming white clouds in the still air. Men tended livestock and split wood for the day's heating. Women prepared midday meals and planned the afternoon's indoor work. By 10 o'clock, the sun had climbed high enough to soften the bite in the air, and the day felt manageable, even pleasant for January. Then the wind shifted. Instead of the steady northwest breeze that had blown for 3 days, the air began moving from the south, carrying warmth that felt almost spring-like against exposed skin. The temperature climbed to nearly 40 degrees by noon, warm enough that some settlers opened windows to air out stuffy rooms and children played outside without heavy coats. The sudden warmth was a gift, a break from the relentless cold that had gripped the territory since Christmas. But experienced plainsmen knew better than to trust January thaws. Caleb Wright, splitting wood behind his claim house, noticed the wind's direction and the unusual warmth and told his wife to keep extra firewood stacked inside near the stove. Mrs. Price, visiting a family 3 miles south, watched the sky and decided to cut her visit short, hitching her horse to the buggy an hour earlier than planned. Lars Nilsson, checking his livestock and noting the wind shift, brought an extra armload of split oak into his cabin and stacked it near the stove. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the wind died completely. The sudden stillness was unnerving, the kind of quiet that came before violent weather. The temperature held steady near 40 degrees, but the air felt different, charged with the tension that preceded major storms. Cloud formations that had been scattered and harmless began building along the northern horizon, dark masses that seemed to grow as people watched them. By 3 o'clock, the northern sky was black from horizon to zenith, and the wind had returned with savage force. Not the steady blow that settlers expected from winter storms, but violent gusts that hit 40 and 50 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally across the prairie in sheets so thick they turned day to twilight in minutes. The temperature dropped like a stone, 40 degrees to 20 to 0 to 15 below in less than 2 hours. The blizzard that would later be called the Children's Blizzard had arrived with the speed and fury that killed the unprepared. Snow fell at rates that defied measurement, accumulating in drifts that reached doorknobs and windowsills within the first hour. The wind drove the snow with such force that it found every gap in construction, every loose board, every poorly chinked joint. Claim houses that had seemed tight and comfortable suddenly leaked cold air from dozens of sources as the storm tested every aspect of their construction. Roads disappeared under uniform white that showed no landmarks or boundaries. Fence lines vanished. Even buildings 50 yards away became invisible in the whirling snow. In Caleb Wright's cabin, the storm's arrival brought immediate problems. The high open ceiling that had seemed spacious and comfortable became a liability as heated air from the stove rose straight to the rafters and spread uselessly along the underside of the roof. The living zone, the 7-foot-high space where the family actually lived, stayed cold despite the stove burning hot enough to make the iron glow red. Wright fed split oak into the firebox every 20 minutes, burning through his indoor wood supply faster than ever before. But the thermometer at chest height couldn't climb above 38 degrees. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. At 38 degrees, bedding felt clammy and provided little warmth. Food froze in pots if moved more than 3 feet from the stove. Wright's children huddled under every blanket in the house and still shivered, their body heat inadequate to warm the cold air that surrounded them. The family burned nearly 40 pounds of wood during the first 6 hours of the storm, double their normal consumption, and still couldn't achieve livable temperatures in the space where they needed warmth. 300 yards west, Lars Nilsson's cabin told a different story. The same wind hammered his walls and found the same construction gaps that plagued every claim house in the territory. The same snow drove against his windows and door. His stove was no better than Wright's, his firewood no drier, his construction materials no superior. but the thermometer hanging at 5 feet in his main room held steady at 56 degrees throughout the storm's first evening, dropping only to 52 during the coldest hours after midnight. The difference was the canvas ceiling that captured warm air in the living zone and held it there. Heat from the stove rose as physics demanded, but instead of washing away to the rafters, it spread horizontally under the tight canvas and stayed where the family needed it. The 3-foot space above the ceiling quickly equilibrated with the outdoor temperature, cold enough that opening the small inspection hatch would sting exposed skin, but that dead air pocket formed an insulating barrier that slowed heat loss through the roof. Lars burned 24 pounds of wood during the same 6-hour period that Wright burned 40 pounds. Less fuel for better results, a difference that mattered when the storm might last for days and resupply was impossible. His children played quietly on the floor near the table, comfortable in normal winter clothing. His wife prepared meals and mended clothing without the constant shivering that marked the Wright household. The family ate warm food and slept in beds that didn't feel like ice. By the storm's second day, the contrast had become a matter of survival calculation. Wright's family faced a choice between burning through their remaining wood supply to maintain marginal comfort or conserving fuel and accepting dangerous cold in their living space. They chose conservation, letting the interior temperature drop to dangerous levels while rationing their remaining split oak for cooking and minimal heating. Mrs. Price, trapped by the storm at the Jensen homestead 4 miles east, watched similar struggles in a cabin built to the same open rafter standard. The family burned furniture, chairs, a small table, even floorboards pried up from corners to maintain heat enough to prevent frostbite. The children developed the blue-tinged lips and sluggish movements that marked the early stages of hypothermia. Mrs. Price moved them into the same bed and wrapped them in every available blanket, but without adequate room heating, body warmth alone couldn't counteract the cold that surrounded them. The blizzard lasted 36 hours, finally exhausting itself on the morning of January 14th. When the wind died and visibility returned, the human cost became clear. Across the territory, families in standard claim houses had suffered frostbite, pneumonia, and exhaustion from the struggle to stay warm. Some had burned green wood, furniture, even parts of their buildings to generate enough heat for survival. The storm had tested every aspect of frontier construction and found most of it barely adequate for extreme conditions. When the storm cleared and neighbors began checking on each other, the evidence was impossible to dismiss. Mrs. Price, making her rounds to families who might need medical attention after the ordeal, carried her small thermometer and recorded what she found. In cabin after cabin built with open rafters, the readings told the same story. Living spaces that couldn't maintain safe temperatures despite burning dangerous amounts of fuel. But in Lars Nielsen's house, the mercury held steady in the mid-50s, warm enough for normal household activities, achieved with less wood than his neighbors used for marginal survival. The physics behind the difference would not be formally understood by frontier settlers for another generation, but the practical mechanics were observable to anyone who paid attention to how heat moved through enclosed spaces. In standard claim houses, the stove created what amounted to a thermal chimney effect. Cold air entered near the floor through construction gaps and was pulled toward the heat source. As it warmed and rose, it carried energy straight up to the roof peak, where it spread along the rafters and began cooling. The cooled air then descended along the walls, creating circulation patterns that continuously moved heated air away from the living zone. The canvas ceiling interrupted this cycle at exactly the right height. Warm air still rose from the stove, but when it reached 7 feet, it encountered the tight barrier and spread horizontally across the room instead of washing uselessly upward. This created 2 distinct thermal zones, a warm layer below the canvas where people lived and worked, and a cold buffer space above that served as insulation rather than living area. The temperature difference between these zones could be dramatic, 55 degrees at chest height, 20 degrees in the space above the canvas, but the barrier prevented the cold air from washing down into the occupied space. The dead air pocket above the ceiling was crucial to the system's effectiveness. Still air is one of nature's best insulators, and the 3-foot space between canvas and roof formed a stable layer that resisted temperature change. Once this pocket cooled to near outdoor temperatures, it stayed cold, forming a barrier that significantly slowed heat loss through the roof. The small inspection hatch that Lars had built into his ceiling demonstrated this principle clearly. Opening it during cold weather released a rush of frigid air that could be felt several feet away, proof that the space above was serving as an insulating buffer rather than heated volume. This principle had been documented in practical guidance for decades, though few frontier settlers had access to formal building manuals. The United States Department of Agriculture had published bulletins as early as the 1870s emphasizing that roofs and ceilings were major sources of heat loss in farm buildings, and that creating better thermal boundaries at the top of heated spaces could dramatically improve comfort and reduce fuel consumption. The guidance was aimed primarily at livestock barns and granaries, but the physics applied equally to human habitation. Moisture management was equally important to the system's success. The space above the ceiling needed to breathe enough to prevent condensation from building up and rotting the canvas or supporting timbers, but not so much that it carried away the insulating effect of still air. Lars had solved this with careful positioning of the inspection hatch and a few small gaps where the ceiling met the walls, openings just large enough to allow minimal air exchange without creating drafts that would disturb the thermal boundary. The ceiling also served functions beyond temperature control. Claim house roofs, built quickly from rough lumber and covered with tar paper or sod, were notorious for shedding debris into living spaces. Bark, dirt, insects, and small animals frequently fell through gaps between roof boards or worked their way through primitive roofing materials. The canvas ceiling caught this debris before it reached furniture, food, or bedding, making daily housekeeping far more manageable. Mrs. Price observed that families with cloth ceilings spent significantly less time cleaning dust and debris from surfaces, time that could be devoted to other essential tasks. The ceiling's tight weave also revealed animal activity that might otherwise go unnoticed. Mice, rats, and squirrels that entered the roof space through construction gaps were clearly visible as they moved across the canvas, their weight and movement creating shadows and sounds that alerted homesteaders to infestations before they became serious problems. This early warning system was particularly valuable during winter months when grain stores and preserved foods were most vulnerable to rodent damage. Draft control was another measurable benefit. Even well-built claim houses leaked air through dozens of small gaps around window frames, door jambs, between log courses, and at the junction between walls and roof. In open raftered rooms, these leaks created complex air movements that made heating inefficient and uncomfortable. Cold air entering near the floor was quickly pulled upward by the thermal chimney effect, creating drafts that chilled anyone not sitting directly beside the stove. The ceiling barrier reduced this effect by creating a more stable air mass in the living zone, with less vertical movement and more predictable temperature distribution. The fuel savings were substantial and measurable. During the 3-day period following the blizzard, while Wright burned 34 pounds of wood per day to maintain barely adequate temperatures, Lars used 22 pounds for superior comfort. Over a full winter heating season, this difference could amount to several cords of wood, the difference between running short of fuel in March and having adequate reserves for unexpected late storms. The mathematical relationship was straightforward. Wright's stove heated approximately 2,900 cubic feet of air, the full volume of his 12 by 24-foot room from floor to roof peak. Lars's stove only needed to heat 2,100 cubic feet in the space below his ceiling. The 800 cubic foot reduction in heated volume translated to roughly 30% less air to warm, and fuel consumption that reflected this efficiency gain almost exactly. More importantly, the system provided resilience during emergency conditions. When the Wright family was forced to take in 3 neighbors whose chimney had failed during the storm, the additional people made their barely adequate heating completely insufficient. The cabin temperature dropped to dangerous levels despite burning everything combustible they could find. Lars's family, with their more efficient heating system, sheltered 2 adults and 3 children from a collapsed cabin without dropping below 50 degrees in the living space, demonstrating that proper thermal design provided not just comfort, but genuine emergency capacity when community survival depended on mutual aid. The vindication came quietly, without proclamations or admissions of error. Within a week of the blizzard's end, Caleb Wright appeared at Jonas McKay's lumber wagon, asking about canvas and pine boards. He didn't mention Lars by name or acknowledge that his previous criticism had been wrong. He simply said his family needed better heating efficiency and asked McKay to price materials for ceiling work. McKay, who understood frontier pride and the delicate business of adopting ideas that had once been mocked, quoted fair prices and promised delivery without unnecessary conversation. Wright wasn't alone. The Hendersons, 2 miles south, bought 40 yards of duck cloth and hired McKay to install ledgers and joists during the first warm spell in February. The Olson family, whose cabin had nearly become uninhabitable during the storm, purchased rough pine boards and spent 3 days creating a plank ceiling at 7 feet, copying Lars's design down to the small inspection hatch. Mrs. Price, making her rounds to check on families who'd suffered during the blizzard, noted that 5 households within 6 miles had installed some form of lowered ceiling before March arrived. The adoptions followed a predictable pattern. Families began with the cheapest materials they could find: muslin, canvas scraps, even grain sacks sewn together and stretched tight. The results were immediate enough that most invested in better materials within a season or two. Rough pine boards became the preferred upgrade for those who could afford them, creating ceilings that were permanent, stable, and easier to maintain than cloth versions. McKay developed a standard materials list: 30 board feet of pine for joists, 300 square feet of boards for ceiling panels, 5 pounds of cut nails, and a half day of installation work for anyone who wanted professional help. The method spread beyond immediate neighbors through the informal networks that connected scattered homesteads. Mrs. Price carried detailed descriptions to families she visited professionally, explaining the installation process and fuel savings in practical terms that homesteaders could evaluate. Traveling preachers, circuit judges, and supply wagon drivers noticed the warmer interiors and carried reports to other settlements. By winter's end, inquiries about ceiling installations were coming from townships 20 miles away, spread by word of mouth among people who understood that survival improvements were worth investigating regardless of their source. Jonas McKay found himself in the unexpected position of ceiling installation specialist, a skill set that hadn't existed in the territory 6 months earlier. He developed efficient techniques for retrofit work, methods that could transform an open-raftered cabin in a single long day without requiring families to relocate during construction. His standard approach involved installing ledgers around the room perimeter, adding cross joists at 20-inch spacing, and stretching canvas or mounting boards with sufficient tension to prevent sagging. The work required basic carpentry tools but no specialized knowledge, making it accessible to any homesteader with modest building experience. The economic benefits extended beyond fuel savings. Families with efficient heating could maintain comfortable temperatures while burning less wood, freeing up time and labor for other essential tasks. Wright, who had spent entire days during the worst cold cutting and splitting firewood just to keep his family from freezing, found that his improved ceiling reduced his wood consumption enough that he could devote winter days to harness repair, tool maintenance, and other indoor work that contributed to the household economy. The Olson family, with their new board ceiling, began taking in sewing work from neighbors, their cabin now warm enough for detailed handwork that required steady temperatures. Mrs. Price documented the health improvements with the precision of someone who'd seen too many families suffer from inadequate heating. Children in homes with lowered ceilings showed fewer symptoms of respiratory illness during the remainder of the winter. Adults reported better sleep and improved energy levels, effects she attributed to sleeping in consistently warmer air rather than the fluctuating temperatures that marked poorly heated cabins. The elderly and infirm, who were most vulnerable to temperature extremes, showed marked improvement in homes where the heating system could maintain stable conditions in the living zone. The technical validation came from an unexpected source. Professor Edmund Hayes, a traveling agricultural instructor affiliated with the State University's Extension program, arrived in the township during late March to conduct his annual assessment of farming practices and building techniques. Hayes carried instruments for measuring temperature, humidity, and air movement, tools that let him quantify what homesteaders had learned through experience. His measurements confirmed the 15-degree temperature difference between ceiling and non-ceiling homes, documented the fuel consumption variations, and recorded the improved air quality that came from reduced temperature stratification. Hayes incorporated the ceiling technique into his standard recommendations for rural building improvement, describing it in his written reports as a practical application of thermal management principles that significantly improves heating efficiency in small structures. His endorsement carried weight with county officials and lending institutions, legitimizing what had begun as one man's unconventional experiment. The technique appeared in territorial building guidance within 2 years, presented as established best practice rather than innovation. By the following winter, the transformation was complete but unremarked. New claim houses were built with ceilings, as a matter of course, their 7-foot height accepted as the sensible standard for heated rooms. Settlers arriving from eastern states found the low ceilings unremarkable, assuming they reflected local building traditions rather than recent adaptation. The technique had become invisible through success, incorporated so thoroughly into local practice that its origins were forgotten by everyone except those who had lived through the transition. Lars continued his own building projects with quiet satisfaction, refining details and exploring improvements to the basic technique. He experimented with different ceiling heights, testing whether 6.5 feet or 7.5 feet provided better heating efficiency. He tried various materials for insulation above the ceiling, sawdust, dried grass, even layers of newspapers, always measuring temperatures and fuel consumption to quantify the results. His cabin became an informal testing ground for heating improvements, visited by neighbors who wanted to understand the latest refinements before implementing their own upgrades. The principle had proven itself through the most rigorous test the frontier could provide: survival during extreme conditions when conventional methods failed. What had begun as mockery ended as adoption, not through argument or persuasion, but through measurable results that spoke for themselves. If you couldn't afford more heat, you built less room to heat. The logic was simple, the implementation was practical, and the vindication was written in degrees on thermometers throughout the territory.